Hello, OFL fans, and welcome back to the Rundown with the Cowboy Crab. I'm your host, Cowboy Crab, and, a little bit late on this episode of the Rundown. I was pretty busy yesterday, didn't get much time in to do this, but good news for me is I still get it's most of the games of Week 3 haven't been played yet, only some of them, but I'll still give my thoughts and predictions on those that have come. But also, we're going to give you a recap of Week 2. And, yeah, just quick little apologies. I couldn't get this out yesterday. I was very busy. And if I could have, I would have. But, unfortunately, I was unable to. Anyways, let's get straight into the recap for Week 2. And then we'll get over a little bit of kind of a big thing that came over last week. For anybody that hasn't heard it yet, but we'll get into that later. Starting off here in Week 2, the Toros beat the Rams 56-47. Phoenix wins 62-55 over the Sunbirds. Thunderbirds lose 39-40 over the Knights. Punishers win 38-14. Panthers win 52-35. Greats win 63-36. Freedom lose 42-58. Sky Kings win 64-38. Turks win 42-41. Firecats lose 51-53. Raptors lose 41-64 to the Mustangs. Jackrabbits lose 60-61 to the Bruisers. Nighthawks lose 43-45 to the Raiders. Bears lose 42-46 to Green Bay. Snowhawks, there we go, win 66-46 over the Spartans. Twisters lose 70-76 over the Bolts. And lastly, the Huskies will win 54-16. Now, let's see how I did on those predictions for Week 2. I was wrong about the Rams. I was right about Atlanta. I was wrong about the Thunderbirds. I was wrong about the Aztecs. Wrong about the Ducks. I was right about the Dragons. Right about the Sky Kings. Wrong about the Vikings. Wrong about the Twisters. Right about the Snowhawks. Right about the Mustangs. Wrong about the Jackrabbits. Right about the Raiders. Wrong about the Bears. Wrong about the Firecats. Wrong with the Sentinels. And I think I was right with the Turks. Yeah, okay, I was right with the Turks. Overall, let me just quickly count. Five, 5 and 7, 5 and 8, 5 and 9, 5 and 10, 5 and 11. Overall, last week I was 6 and 11 on predictions. That is not that good compared to last week's predictions. I believe I was over 500 with percentage on that one. This week, not so good. But anyways, let's get into the kind of an event that occurred last week. Or game change update, I guess you could say. So what happened was the onside onside ball got added into the game. There's some demonstrations currently in the Old Football Network and an explanation made by Astwood about it. So if you're interested in that and you're in the Discord server, I would highly recommend checking it out because that's going to be something that you are going to watch, that you could likely see during these Week 3 matchups. But, yeah, really outside of that, let's start to get into the statistics from last week. Let's see, where does it start? Alright, here we go. We'll start with the Toros and the Rams. I noticed last week I pretty much went an hour. Most of that was stats. So we're gonna make a little edit. We're just gonna cover offensive stats just to try and shorten that time and save space in my throat. So we're gonna start with Houston, and then we're gonna go to Milken. So starting with the Toros at quarterback, Sean HTX, 9.5 drives, 16 for 19, 524 passing yards, and 84.21 completion rate, 8 touchdowns, and an interception. Grimm, 1 play, 1 for 1, 26 yards, 100% passing completion rate. And Woo Walking, half a drive, 0 for 2. That's it for passing. Rushing, Sean had 5 rushes and 39 yards, and Woo Walking had 3 rushes and 15 yards. And then we get to receiving. Jackrabbits, 6 receptions, 201 yards, and 4 touchdowns. Mr. Magic Camara, 5 receptions, 184 yards, and 3 touchdowns. Shipping, 3 receptions, 99 yards, and a touchdown. Grimm, 1 reception, 31 yards. Luna, 1 reception, 26 yards. And S3 MPX1, 1 reception for 9 yards. Moving on to the Rams. Radiance, 29 for 39, 504 passing yards, a 66.67 completion rate, 5 touchdowns, and 3 interceptions. Rushing rise, Radiance, 11 rushes, 150 rushing yards, and a touchdown. And Puzzler, 3 rushes, 7 rushing yards, and a touchdown. Moving on to receiving for the Rams, Wood Creek TDs, 6 receptions, 167 receiving yards, and 3 touchdowns. Azriel, 3 receptions, 114 receiving yards, no touch, and 114 receiving yards. Puzzler, 11 receptions, 114 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Dima Argima, 3 receptions, 75 receiving yards, and a touchdown. John Cena, 1951, a reception, 19 yards. And Tom Tebow, 2 receptions and 15 yards. So your stats for Toros Rams. Moving on, Sunbirds Phoenix. Alright, we'll start with the Sunbirds. Frankie, 23 for 37, 522 passing yards, 62.16 completion rate, 4 touchdowns and 4 interceptions. Same amount of touchdowns and interception. That's an interesting thing. Take note of. Frankie, 27 rushes, 153 rushing yards, 3 touchdowns. And Weshin, 1 rush, 1 rushing yard, and a touchdown. And moving on, receiving, destroying defenses, 1 reception, 38 yards. Big Chungus Hood Irony, 1 reception, 39 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Crap. Kijada, I think. Honestly, I have no idea. It's a hard name to say. 1 reception and 18 yards. Patrick, 7 receptions, 268 receiving yards with 2 touchdowns. Weshin, 2 receptions, 27 receiving yards. Tiny Boomin, 6 receptions, 72 receiving yards. Loonside with 3 receptions and 88 receiving yards and a touchdown. Moving on to the Phoenix. Sifo Jelly with 29 for 32 with 670 passing yards, a 71.88 completion rate, 7 touchdowns and interceptions. Sifo Jelly also with 7 rushes and 24 rushing yards and a touchdown. Ozzy Oswald on the reception side of things, 2 receptions and 50 receiving yards and a touchdown. Alpha Santana, 7 receptions, 240 receiving yards, and a touchdown. 10-17 Pops with 2 receptions and 34 receiving yards and a touchdown. Chaos Vert, 5 receptions, 108 receiving yards and a touchdown. Alright, no, that's 2 touchdowns. Popeye's Pounder, 5 receptions, 164 receiving yards and 3 touchdowns. X-Ites with a reception and 48 receiving yards. And X-Side with 1 reception and 16 receiving yards. Those are your stats for Sunbirds Phoenix. Moving on, Aztecs Punishers. Alright. Alright. Nizyami with an 8 for 20 and 280 passing yards, a 40 completion rate, 2 touchdowns and 2 interceptions. And John the Boat, 4 for 8, 90 passing yards, a 50 completion rate, no touchdowns and interception. Alright, moving on to rushing. Nizyami, 4 rushes and 12 rushing yards. John the Boat, 9 rushes and 45 rushing yards. Tripagami, moving on to receptions now. 2 receptions, 65 receiving yards and a touchdown. Andrew, 2 receptions, 65 receiving yards and a touchdown. Brandon Says with 2 receptions and 36 receiving yards. Flyada with 3 receptions, 92 receiving yards. Okay, or you throw to me. 2 receptions, 51 receiving yards, and John the Boat, 1 reception and 65 receiving yards. Alright, moving on to the Punishers. Fared NBA, 18 for 31, 382 passing yards, 58.6 .6 completion rate, 5 touchdowns and interception. Fared NBA also 18 rushes and 117 rushing yards. Last Slime with 6 receptions, 113 receiving yards and 3 touchdowns. Blue Fire Knights, 3 receptions, 68 receiving yards. XD Nance with 1 reception, 4 receiving yards and a touchdown. Honda Civic Driver, 4 receptions, 65 receiving yards and a touchdown. Watson Santana, 2 receptions and 31 receiving yards. First Slime with 2 receptions, 84 receiving yards. There's the Aztecs Punishers. I'm going to take a drink real quick. There we go. Alright, moving on. Thunderbirds Knights. Kelvin for the Thunderbirds, 17 for 29 and 503 passing yards, a 58.62 completion rate, 5 touchdowns and 3 interceptions. Kelvin also had 3 rushes and 17 rushing yards. Meanwhile, on the receiving end of things, Star Wars Freak, 4 receptions, 177 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns. Ku with 3 receptions, 151 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Grab Savardo with 2 receptions, 24 receiving yards, and a touchdown. 14 Azasin with 4 receptions and 68 receiving yards. Smoking Out the Windows, 2 receptions, 52 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Ryun C4 with 1 reception and 15 receiving yards. And Ferris Bluer with 1 reception, 18 receiving yards. Moving on to DC, Young Relly, 18 for 30 with a 529 passing yards and a 60 completion rate, 5 touchdowns and 2 interceptions. And Demacus, 0 for 1 and an interception. Young Relly also with 11 rushes, 49 rushing yards, and a touchdown. Moving on, receiving, Manny Tukoski, 5 receptions, 85 receiving yards. Kodak YRN with 5 receptions, 188 receiving yards, 2 touchdowns. Demarcus, I think. 2 receptions, 49 receiving yards, and touchdowns. Snoke with 2 receptions, 68 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Mater Potato 19 with a reception, 45 receiving yards, and a touchdown. And N4 Ox with 3 receptions, 91 receiving yards. Alright. That was Thunderbirds Knights. If I remember correctly, some of these games never got stats. Well, I think some games didn't get stats, so could be wrong. Moving on though, it's Greats versus Ducks. Starting for the Greats, Cliff Jean, 28 for 35 at 672 passing yards and 80 completion rate, 9 touchdowns and no interceptions. Cliff Jean also had 3 rushes and 25 rushing yards. Moving on, Straw Hat Leafy, 7 receptions, 124 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns. Trippy Elds with 6 receptions, 56 receiving yards. MCKs with 5 receptions, 236 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Harl, 8 receptions, 222 receiving yards, and 5 touchdowns. Azura Demovic with a reception, 4 receiving yards, and a touchdown. And Green Sharky with a reception and 30 yards. Moving on to the Ducks. A Pend with 24 for 39, 438 passing yards, 4 touchdowns, and 3 interceptions. A Pend also had 4 rushes and 16 rushing yards and a touchdown. Moving on to receiving. XV10, 6 receptions, 80 receiving yards. Dramatic Load with 6 receptions, 131 receiving yards, and 3 touchdowns. And Tedor with 5 receptions, 64 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Skeptical with 4 receptions and 89 receiving yards. And Stem Embol with 3 receptions and 74 receiving yards. Your stacks for Greats Ducks. Alright, moving on. Just quickly do something real quick. Alright. Moving on. Warriors Sky Kings. Alright, for the Warriors, Free Frigid, 20 for 34, 514 passing yards, 5 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions. Free Frigid also had 5 rushes, 43 rushing yards, and a touchdown. Moving on, receiving, Astro World Mike, 3 receptions, 113 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns. DO2 Russ with 4 receptions, 136 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Yamadama Ingle Fro, 2 receptions, 26 receiving yards. Skirting with 3 receptions, 88 receiving yards. What You Do in Polo with 5 receptions, 99 receiving yards and a touchdown. Mind Lab, 2 receptions, 35 receiving yards and a touchdown. Fafa with 1 reception and 17 receiving yards. Moving on to the Sky Kings. South, 17 for 22, 581 passing yards with a 77.27 completion rate and 9 touchdowns. That's a lot of touchdowns. With no interceptions either. Wow. Alright. Moving on. South, also 6 rushes, 33 rushing yards. Eddie Hova with 1 rush, 4 rushing yards. Liu CH with 4 receptions, 149 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns. Goes with 3 receptions, 63 receiving yards, 2 touchdowns. Obsta with 4 receptions, 138 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns. Wait, no, I think I read that wrong. Eddie Hova. Alright, no, I didn't. Eddie Hova with 3 receptions, 49 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Chasey Minja, I think. 2 receptions, 156 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns. And Injire with 1 reception, 26 receiving yards. That's Warriors Sky Kings. Alright, moving on is Jackrabbits versus Bruisers. Alright, here we go. Jackrabbits versus Bruisers. Configured. 34 for 52. 681 passing yards, a 65.38 completion rate, 8 touchdowns, 3 interceptions. Configured also had 9 rushes, 51 rushing yards, and a touchdown. Dame Nasty, 7 receptions, 151 receiving yards, 2 touchdowns. Outer Parts, 3 receptions, 73 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Value, 4 receptions, 90 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns. Yoda Suba Lover with 7 receptions, 96 receiving yards. Monster Marlin, 6 receptions, 86 receiving yards. Lorenzo, 7 receptions, 211 receiving yards, and 3 touchdowns. Moving on to the Bruisers. Beast, 22 for 32, 566 passing yards, 68.75 completion rate, 7 touchdowns and an interception. Beast also had 22 rushes, 200 rushing yards, 2 touchdowns. Receiving wise, Plumey, 11 receptions, 309 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns. Peros, 4 receptions, 91 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Clemsta, 2 receptions, 31 receiving yards. Nay, 1 reception, 20 receiving yards, and a touchdown. And 2 and 6 I with 5 receptions, 128 receiving yards, and 3 touchdowns. Alright. Moving on to the Raptors versus Mustangs. Chimpanzee Slayer for the Raptors, 21 for 28, 469 passing yards, 75 completion rate, 5 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions. Chimpanzee Slayer also had 3 rushes and 12 rushing yards. Duncan Destroyer, 4 receptions, 77 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Hobos with 4 receptions, 90 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Loki Pokey with 5 receptions, 112 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Deco Runs with 3 receptions, 79 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns. Moho Hoey with 3 receptions, 79 receiving yards. And Privatized with 2 receptions, 32 receiving yards. Moving on to Motor City. Instigated at 29 for 35, 759 passing yards and 9 touchdowns. Instigated also 2 rushes and 12 rushing yards. Trick Stunta, 5 receptions, 208 receiving yards and a touchdown. In Spot I with 6 receptions, 130 receiving yards and a touchdown. Excuse me, Misty, 2 receptions, 27 receiving yards and a touchdown. In Daru, 10 receptions, 298 receiving yards and 3 touchdowns. Iowa, 2 receptions, 86 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns. And Gabioki, 1 reception, 10 receiving yards and a touchdown. That's Raptors Mustangs. Moving on, Freedom vs. Dragons. Alright, we'll start with the Freedom. Fueled up, 17 completion, 17 for 31, 467 passing yards, a 54.84 completion rate, 6 touchdowns and an interception. Fueled up also had 4 rushes for 42 rushing yards. Fent made 2 receptions, 38 receiving yards. Kia Dog, 4 receptions, 195 receiving yards, 2 touchdowns. Giggity, 1 reception, 10 receiving yards. Ruins Me, 6 receptions, 143 receiving yards, and 3 touchdowns. Ruin 'em, 3 receptions, 37 receiving yards, and a touchdown. And Ezekiel with 1 reception for 44 receiving yards. Alright, moving on. Randy Moss, 23 for 34 with 492 passing yards and a touchdown. And an interception. Randy Moss also had 17 rushes for 151 rushing yards and a touchdown. Alright. True Warriors, 7 receptions, 153 receiving yards, 2 touchdowns. Heist, 6 receptions, 89 receiving yards, 2 touchdowns. 2-4, 3 receptions, 86 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Gaelic, 1 reception, 68 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Kill Ninjas with 3 receptions and 46 receiving yards. And I'm here C, I think, with 3 receptions, 50 receiving yards, and a touchdown. That's Freedom Dragons. Alright, moving on. Firecats Destroyers. Alright. Die Divine, 13 for 22, 498 passing yards, 59 completions, and a touchdown. Wait, no. Let me try again. Die Divine, 13 for 22, 498 passing yards, a 59.9 completion rate, 6 touchdowns and interception. There we go. Di Divine also had 10 rushes, 102 rushing yards and a touchdown. XG 37, 4 receptions, 173 receiving yards and a touchdown. Di Clout, 3 receptions, 171 receiving yards and 3 touchdowns. Keybinder, 2 receptions, 75 receiving yards. Diora Rook, 1 reception and 10 receiving yards. Foreign Status, 3 receptions, 42 receiving yards. And Dimec, 1 reception, 27 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Alright. Moving on. Can't stop yawning. Resparkled, 18 for 27. 498 passing yards. A 66.67 completion rate. 6 touchdowns and an interception. Resparkled also at 16 rushes and 98 rushing yards on the day. Necropolis, 6 receptions, 223 receiving yards, 3 touchdowns. HKVM, 4 receptions, 33 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Maxi Bands, 4 receptions, 93 receiving yards. LV Drew, with 4 receptions, 67 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns. Micah the Immortal, 3 receptions, 17 receiving yards. Glizzy, 1 reception, 61 receiving yards. And Baddest Boy Brian, 1 reception and 4 receiving yards. That's Firecats Destroyers. Moving on, Toronto versus Green Bay. Alright, for Toronto, top notch, 12 for 16. Hang on. Alright, 12 for 16. There we go. 293 passing yards, 75 completion rate, 3 touchdowns and interception. And Clutch Hill, 7 for 14, 225, a 50% passer completion rate, 3 touchdowns and 2 interceptions. Moving on, top notch, 1 rush, 5 rushing yards. Clutch Hill, 7 rushes, 36 rushing yards. Joseph Clutch, 6 receptions, 110 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Kinks, or KYN3X. I read it as Kinks, but that's what it looks like to me. 1 reception, 34 receiving yards. Boss Doretta, 7 receptions, 200 receiving yards, 2 touchdowns. Beverly, 2 receptions, 52 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Kamari, to Ari. I don't know. 20 putting numbers and letters together as a name that I don't get. 1 reception, 75 receiving yards, and I'm Jasmine. 3 receptions, 58 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns. It's weird. Oh, it's a battle of purple teams last week. The only difference is what the secondary color is. Anyways. Logium, 13 for 15, 272 passing yards, 86.67 completion rate, 3 touchdowns and an interception. Logium also with 25 rushes, 175 rushing yards, and 3 touchdowns. Waffle Boy, 2 receptions, 69 receiving yards. Coke Bricks, 1 reception, 18 receiving yards. Donna Sosa, 3 receptions, 45 receiving yards. BTD Side Leagues, 2 receptions, 36 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Mazza, 4 receptions, 90 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns. And I'm a noob, 2 receptions, 26 receiving yards. Alright, that is Toronto versus Green Bay. Moving on, Snowhawks versus Spartans. Only got a couple more. Alright, here we go. Alright, Tri-Fi, 24 for 30, 786 passing yards, 80 completion rate, and 10 touchdowns. And Nua Bates, 0 for 1, and an interception. It's just one play, and he managed to screw it up. Tri-Fi, 3 rushes, 38 rushing yards. Moving on, Lillard. 7 receptions, 206 receiving yards, 3 touchdowns. MLB shifts. 5 receptions, 212 receiving yards, 2 touchdowns. Doodle. 3 receptions, 36 receiving yards. Staffa. 4 receptions, 116 receiving yards, 2 touchdowns. Eula Bates with 3 receptions, 152 receiving yards, and 3 touchdowns. And Hims with 2 receptions, 64 receiving yards. Alright. Moving on. Rocky. 27 for 45, 740 passing yards, 60 completion rate, 7 touchdowns, 3 interceptions. And Rocky also had 1 rush for 5 rushing yards. Esquire, 8 receptions, 166 receiving yards. Mondays, 2 receptions, 30 receiving yards. Brizo, 4 receptions, 109 receiving yards, and 4 touchdowns. Lenses, I think. 9 receptions, 315 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Mike Soner, 3 receptions, 89 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns. And Alistair, 1 reception, 31 receiving yards. Alright, moving on. It is Husky Sentinels. Alright. Miles, 19 for 32, 464 passing yards, 59.38 completion rate, 7 touchdowns. Miles also with 4 rushes and 30 rushing yards. Offensive threat, 4 receptions, 123 receiving yards. Trenton Bowlen user, 8 receptions, 133 receiving yards, 3 touchdowns. Crashing car, 1 reception, 13 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Block, 3 receptions, 108 receiving yards, and a kick return touchdown. That's something you don't see in every day. Here we go. Here we go. For the Sentinels, Popper, 3 for 7, 61 passing yards. No touch, a 42.86 completion rate, no touchdowns, and 2 interceptions. Calder, 13 for 34, 314 passing yards, 38.24 completion rate, 2 touchdowns, and 6 interceptions. A total of 8 interceptions on the day for the Sentinels. No wonder they lost so bad. That's a 6 differential between touchdowns and total interceptions. In fact, Popper threw as many interceptions as Coulter did touchdowns. Jeez. In fact, there were more touchdowns scored. There were more interceptions thrown by the Sentinels than Miles threw touchdowns. That's a stat right there. In fact, that might even be a trivia question. Which team threw more interceptions in total? Which team threw more interceptions than their opponent this season? And I'll know the answer. The answer is the Empire State Sentinels. Moving on, Coulter, 1 rush, 2 rushing yards. Alright, moving on, Coulter, 1 reception, 7 receiving yards. Enzo Cardi, 3 receptions, 135 receiving yards. Havoc, 2 receptions, 9 receiving yards. XBR, 2 receptions, 4 receiving yards. Quando JB, 1 reception and 30 receiving yards. Slaters with 5 receptions, 114 receiving yards, 2 touchdowns. And Zach never broke again, 2 receptions, 40 receiving yards. And that's your stats. Alright, moving on. Only got 4 more. Nighthawks versus Raiders. Kamari, 21 for 31, 431 passing yards, 67.74 completion rate, and 5 touchdowns. Kamari also had 3 rushes, 81 rushing yards, and a touchdown. Kill for L, 2 receptions, 55 receiving yards. Alright. Can't stop yawning again. It's great. Baysane, 7 receptions, 101 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Lil Reduce, 3 receptions, 58 receiving yards, 2 touchdowns. Blue-Eyed Soul with 2 receptions and 53 receiving yards. Chuggin' Dirt, 3 receptions, 62 receiving yards. Goku with 2 receptions, 24 receiving yards, and a touchdown. And Whizbinder, 2 receptions, 78 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Moving on. Baney Stretchy Nuts, 14 for 22, 404 passing yards, 63.64 completion rate, 6 touchdowns, and an interception. Alright. Moving on, Very Stretchy Nuts also had 15 rushes for 84 rushing yards. Alright. White Lightning, 2 receptions, 57 receiving yards. Mouse Stupid, 5 receptions, 189 receiving yards, 3 touchdowns. Trivy Raggy, I think. 3 receptions, 72 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Orstasai, 3 receptions, 63 receiving yards, and a touchdown. And Water C4, 1 touchdown, 23 receiving yards, and a touchdown. I think I said touchdown twice. 1 reception and 1 touchdown. That's what I meant. Alright. Moving on. This one might be a little bit shorter than the last one, or it could be the same time. Honestly, I don't know. 3 more. Alright. Rattlers, Turks. Here we go. East Sydney. 13 for 20. 410 passing yards, 65 completion rate, 4 touchdowns. East Sydney also with 4 rushes, 63 rushing yards, 2 touchdowns. Moving on, Pizzeria, 4 receptions, 156 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Traders, 1 reception, 8 receiving yards. Bobby Flipped, 3 receptions, 113 receiving yards, 2 touchdowns. Logan Byrne, 3 receptions, 68 receiving yards. Big Bada J, 1 reception, 27 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Football Effect, 1 reception, 38 receiving yards. Moving on, three trims, 19 for 32, 508 passing yards, 59.38 completion rate, and 5 touchdowns. Why can't I stop yawning? I don't get it. Alright. 3 trims also, 15 rushes, 63 rushing yards, and a touchdown. Kane Football, 5 receptions, 213 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Chris, 3 receptions, 52 receiving yards, 2 touchdowns. Tyler Byrne, 3 receptions, 81 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Cookie Byrne with 4 receptions, 74 receiving yards. And Ella Zane, 4 receptions, 88 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Alright, moving on. Moving on. 2 more. Panthers versus Vikings. Aha. 7 with 18 for 24, 405 passing yards, 75% completion rate, 5 touchdowns, and an interception. Aha, also 10 rushes, 56 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Noble, 9 receptions, 264 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns. Volcano God, 1 reception, 15 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Garza, 3 receptions, 76 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Ahu, 1 reception for 5 yards. Wide receiver Samuel, 3 receptions, 40 receiving yards, and a touchdown. And 42 XO, 1 reception for 5 receiving yards. Moving on. To the Vikings, trick shot, 6 for 13 with 153 passing yards, 46.15 completion rate, a touchdown and interception. And LMJ, a 8 for 12, 218 passing yards, 66.67 completion rate, 2 touchdowns and interception. Moving on, big shots, 6 rushes, 38 rushing yards, and no touchdown. Alright, LMJ, 5 rushes, 18 rushing yards, and 2 touchdowns. There we go. Alright. Moving on. Try for 6. 4 receptions, 90 receiving yards. Blue Fago, 5 receptions, 130 receiving yards, 2 touchdowns. Grave Price, 2 receptions, 58 receiving yards. Trig Shot, 2 receptions, 69 receiving yards, and a touchdown. And Phil Binder, 1 reception for 23 receiving yards. Alright. Moving on to the last one. Alright, here we go. Twisters versus Bolts. Here we go. Miss Drew, 40 for 54. 915 passing yards. Almost 1,000 yards passing on the day. 74.7 completion rate, 10 touchdowns and 2 interceptions. And Azuna Yuki, 0 for 2. That's about it. Misdrew 4 rushes or 4 rushing yards, so an average of 1 rush for 1 rush for 1 yard. Yeah, that pretty much that. All right, moving on. Cyclade, 6 receptions, 121 receiving yards. Joski, 6 receptions, 400 receiving yards, and 4 touchdowns. Luis Sosa, 6 receptions, 205 receiving yards, 4 touchdowns. Dylan, 4 receptions, 65 receiving yards, and Sniper, 7 receptions, 117 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Alright, moving on. Last team. Matthew, 23 for 37, 691 passing yards, 62.16 completion rates, 9 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. Matthew also with 8 rushes and 96 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns. And here's receiving Utopia, 3 receptions and 69 receiving yards, 2 touchdowns. Chugga Burn, 7 receptions, 227 receiving yards, 3 touchdowns. Real Crumble Cake, 2 receptions, 62 receiving yards. Holy, 4 receptions, 145 receiving yards, 3 touchdowns. Cowards, 3 receptions, 60 receiving yards. Ventriloquist, 3 receptions, 78 receiving yards, and a touchdown. And Phenom, 1 reception and 13 receiving yards. Those are all your stats for all the games from week 2. Alright, let's get into week 3. Let me just quickly check what games have already been done. So the current games that have been the current games that are already done are the Toros versus Knights, the Sunbirds versus Thunderbirds, Phoenix versus Rams, and that's it. Alright, so can't do prediction. So I did do the polls for the predictions. Let me just see who I had. So I had the Knights winning, had the Thunderbirds winning, had the Phoenix winning. So moving on to the rest of the games. Greats versus Warriors, I'm going Greats. Freedom versus Sky Kings, I'm going Sky Kings. Ducks, Aztecs, I'm going Ducks. Bruisers, Punishers, I'm going Bruisers. Vikings, Bolts, I picked the Vikings. I think they can get an upset on the road. Dragons, Snowhawks, I also think the Dragons are going to get the upset. Panthers, Raptors, I'm going Panthers. Destroyers, Raiders, I went Destroyers. Spartans versus Sentinels, I went Spartans. Nighthawks versus Jackrabbits, went Nighthawks. Twisters versus Rattlers, went Twisters. Huskies versus Bears, I went Bears. Invaders versus Firecats, I went Firecats. And lastly, Mustangs versus Turks, I went with the Turks. So yeah, I think that's pretty much it for this week's episode of the Rundown with the Cowboy Crab. Not finding updated standings, so yeah, I think that's gonna be it here, folks. Just a quick little reminder, if you're an OFL player, coach, staff member, anything like that, want to be on an episode of the Rundown with the Cowboy Crab for an interview, DM me on Discord, and we'll go from there. Anyways, folks, we're going to close it out here. Representing Team Ocean, I am the Cowboy Crab, saying so long, everybody.